Now, it would seem a given that architects would be interested in institutions and in studying their typologies and developing their typologies. But one has to remember that this institutionalism, this imagining of public buildings, was completely new in the Renaissance. What's important for us is that this relation of the ideal city and inventing institutions or public institutions anew with which to reorganize the social order really emerged fully articulated only for the first time in the 18th century, so centuries later, with architects like Ledoux, who is looking at the factory as a kind of template for an ideal society, and also with the works of the architect to whom I want now to turn, Étienne Louis Boullée, another one of these visionary architects whose City of the Dead I am now going to turn to. This is a pen and ink drawing from the 1780s. So we're dealing with the decade before the French Revolution broke out. The French Revolution begins in 1789. Boullée is an extraordinary character historically along these lines. He's an academically trained architect. His career spans the 18th century, this period we call the Enlightenment, the period which saw the birth of social philosophy, of notions of democracy, of new forms of government that would challenge royal authority. And by the end of the century, of course, with the American Revolution and the French Revolution, we see society actually rewritten. So it's no surprise that utopian schemes and the imagining of public buildings would occur in this historical context. But to go back to Boullée, this is an architect who was born in 1728 and he died in 1799, the very year the French Revolution came to an end. So he is actually a kind of perfect fit as a kind of architectural figura of the Enlightenment. He's someone who was elected to France's official architectural institution, the Royal Academy of Architecture. He took himself to be a great proponent of classical ideas and of pure geometric forms in architecture. He essentially imagined a whole series of public buildings. He fetishized the colossal and architecture. And most of all, most curiously, he built relatively little. His oeuvre is essentially found in drawings like this one of unbuildable projects, in fact. Yet he emerged as one of the most influential theorists and teachers of his time, and we can continue actually to feel his legacy in modern and contemporary architecture. So how does he show us a city of the dead, a kind of an urban fabrication that extends the cemetery into an entire city fabric? We have at the rear of the image a domed basilica, obviously a centralized structure which is elevated. And if you notice, the curves and lines of its contours actually formalize the silhouette of the mountain, the huge mountain that's rising behind it. In other words, here, architecture is not simply in symbiosis with nature, it's actually a metaphor for it. You sense the ghost of the ideal city in this so-called City of the Dead, rendered as eternal as nature itself. And you're going to see in the drawings that we're going to look through, Boullée, like Ledoux, began to develop a whole typology of public buildings, churches, cemeteries, libraries, schools, military forts. And in this, of course, is inscribed a utopian aspiration, a rewriting of society through architecture. There's another aspect of Boullée's architecture on paper that we need to address, however. They are deeply engaged with the aesthetic philosophy of the period. In particular, Boullée was looking to create a kind of equivalent in architecture to what the philosophers who were his contemporaries called the sublime. This is a concept that was developed in the 18th century. It was used to describe, imagine the state of being awestruck, of being overwhelmed by the infinity of nature, by the infinity of God. In other words, by things that seem so incommensurable that we don't know how to take account of them, that we actually don't know how to represent them. In other words, the sublime corresponds to that which is immeasurable, unrepresentable, inconceivable. Boullée's writings and his images, these pen and ink sketches, sought to take those kinds of qualities associated with the sublime, and they were conveniently typologized by philosophers. I'm thinking in particular of Edmund Burke or Immanuel Kant by the end of the century. And these qualities can be identified as follows: obscurity, power, vastness, infinity, magnificence, silence, suddenness, the intermittent sound or the intermittent sight. And Boullée took these ideas and, as it were, turned them into architecture. What he was after ultimately was to make architecture somehow transcendent, to make architecture reach a kind of philosophical condition. And what's so interesting here is that somehow we're returning to the phenomenology of architecture. In other words, how our bodies, how our senses react to the spaces around us, to the architectural spaces around us. So how does this work? How does this work in terms of a paper architecture? What I'm showing you here is what Boullée called a funerary monument characterizing the genre of a buried architecture. What does this mean? Well, first, it means that the image is somehow thematically tied to the sublime because the subject or purpose of the building we see is, in fact, an architecture of death. It is a kind of monumental gateway to a cemetery, if you will. So it's representing the unrepresentable in architectural form. This is quite a contradiction. Second, the title is a giveaway to this. It characterizes what Boullée called a genre or type. This is an important word in the 18th century, type or typology. It's a genre or type of architecture, and so presumably it typifies a set of characteristics or properties. These characteristics or properties are meant to have a certain effect or prompt a certain kind of reaction on the viewer. Third, that genre or type actually has a name. Boullée calls it buried architecture. The idea here is that you actually bury a colossal structure so that architecture itself becomes an analogy to the tomb. Out of this typologizing, out of this searching for a typological formatting of public buildings, Boullée developed what later would be called architecture parlante, or speaking architecture. This is very much along the lines of what Ledoux was doing at the Salt Works. And the idea is that buildings somehow explain their function or explain their identity through their formal attributes. They speak their names. The idea emerged in Boullée's collected writings and his drawings, which essentially span this late 18th century period from about 1778 into the French Revolution, into 1793. And all of this manifested itself in utopian terms, in an architecture on paper that was rendered monochromatically and that offered a kind of panoply of unbuildable edifices, presenting projects for public buildings moored to huge scale, to a largeness of scale, and highly formalized geometric vocabularies. This is the rise of public building and public building typologies, and we understand when we go back to the 18th century that this was a fundamentally utopian undertaking. So what was this architectural language of utopia, if you will? Well, it's based on regularized solids, gargantuan spheres, pyramids, huge quadrangles, with each geometric form somehow thematizing a given purpose, a given use. The result is that the symbolic aspect of architecture, in other words, how you invoke the character of a structure, superseded all practical implications. In other words, Boullée was absolutely not interested in whether these could be built or not. He was interested in their symbolic apparatus and their social utility. So the example here is a military fort. And for Boullée, military architecture needed to suggest, quote unquote, the idea of force. Accordingly, what you see in the drawing, or what you see in Boulée's imagining of the fort, is that the actual techniques, the technologies of construction here are pretty much irrelevant. He's not interested in mechanical problems, technical issues. He actually dismissed Vitruvius for being too interested in engineering, because this was not, for Boullée, the primary purpose of architecture. The primary purpose of architecture was to imagine possibilities for Boullée. Instead, he was far more interested in how we literally read the identity of his structure, which is a round central tower flanked by 4 square ones set on the diagonal. In other words, this is an architecture of signs. You have an absolutely massive shield. It's in fact the shield of the great Greek warrior Achilles plastered on the facade. You have walls so massive that they give the idea of indestructibility, and the fact that they actually couldn't be built was completely beside the point for Boullée. You have piles of cannonballs and cannons set to each side of the flanking towers. All of this is a kind of symbolic apparatus that produces signs so that we can read the building, so that the architecture, again, can speak its identity, speak its character, speak its name. Another example would be something like this, in this so-called geometrical elevation of a chapel of the dead. Again, we have the pyramidal shape, which we associate with the memorial, with commemoration, with the end of life. We're meant to understand this commemorative purpose through this visual allusion, if you will, to the sublime, which Boullée actually stresses in his definition of architecture. And when we turn to his writings, we can read into them his deliberate allusion to the philosophical ideas that were circulating in the period. Here is Boullée. Architecture is the only art by which we can put nature to work. And this unique advantage makes manifest its sublime aspect. The means by which nature can be put to work, which belong to architecture, come from the power to effect what poetry, in other words, language, can only describe. The art of moving us through the effects of light belongs to architecture. This is phenomenology. For in all the monuments that are capable of stirring the soul and making us experience the horrors of darkness, or, conversely, that create transportive sensations through brilliant effects, the architect, who must know these means and master them, can, dare I say it, I create light. This is an extraordinarily ambitious definition of architecture, and there are several points to retain. First, that architecture is linked to nature. Second, that the sublime character of architecture is based on that link to nature. And third, Boullée's assumption that somehow the formal character of a building affects our senses. We feel horror at darkness, we feel jubilation at light. And finally, the equation between architect and God. I create light. The assumption here is that there's a direct relationship between highly abstract forms and human sensations, and that geometrical shapes can actually render architecture transcendent. Drawings in this sense become a kind of template for the sublime and for inciting a sublime reaction in their viewers. Here's another one of these drawings. This one's a perspectival entrance to a cemetery in which darkness and the pyramidal form evoke the end of life. Over and over again, we see these mechanisms at work. For example, in this project for a metropolitan church, where we can discern the regular succession and uniformity of its kit of parts that, according to philosophers of the time, artificially recreated the sense of infinity. Listen to this account. Whenever we repeat any idea frequently, the mind, by a sort of mechanism, repeats it long after. Place a number of uniform and equidistant marks in a regular sequence, such as a row of columns. They will cause it to seem to extend to a length almost incredible and seem multiplied without end. Likewise, in a rotunda, you can nowhere fix a boundary. Turn which way you will, the same object still seems to continue, and the imagination has no rest. But the parts must be uniform, as well as circularly disposed, to give this figure its full force. In this scheme of things, the architectural sublime is actually created by the repetition of columns, by placing uniform columnar screens on all sides, and circularity is also crucial to the effect. Here it shows up in this gargantuan dome, a dome technologically which could never have been erected at the time because of its sheer size. And of course, to go back to the sublime, it is a rotunda that offers no boundaries and no endpoints. It is the architectural equivalent, if you will, of infinity. And then there's the uniformity of the plan, too, with 4 arms and entrances all exactly alike, all the same, and unlike Ledoux, completely devoid of program. But now I want to return to where I began, and the idea that no matter how sublime Boullée's projects seem, they were nonetheless very much tied to contemporaneous architectural projects. In other words, projects that were actually built. What Boullée in some cases was doing was looking at the built and then using the real to create a fiction, to create a new topology. So for the Metropolitan Church, all we need to do is to consider a church that was built by the architect Soufflot, the Church of Sainte-Geneviève, which is now the French Pantheon. And if we compare the plans, Boullée on the left, Soufflot on the right, we can see that basically what Boullée did was to take Soufflot's church and turn it into some kind of geometric giant. Boullée's focus on vast dimensions, on a kind of formal purity, on a repetition, is inscribed in a sacred space that had a real precursor, a built expression in Soufflot's church. And what Boullée essentially did was to fantastically blow Soufflot's church out of scale through representation, through drawing. The idea, however, was already there in Soufflot's church. This is typical of the visionary architect's translation of the real into the ideal, of producing a fiction from the concrete. So no matter how sublime Boullée's projects seem, they were nonetheless tied to contemporaneous projects that were actually built.